Hey, so as you can see, it's pretty dark. But anyways, in fact, I'm probably just gonna turn off the camera from here on out and just walk through the slides for this week. Sorry for the difficulties here. We're going to talk about individual differences today. I'm going to start off by talking about what we usually call cognitive abilities, and then we'll talk a bit about personality trait characteristics as well, and I'll go into the distinction that I just made there later. When we talk about cognitive ability, there's really no substitute for knowing a lot. Well, that's well, if you pay attention to the citations in the book, you'll occasionally see John Campbell referenced. That is the psychologist who originally said this, and that was reported to me by one of his students, Nathan Kunsel. I don't know why I insist on not actually naming names here. So when we're talking about cognitive ability, we want to well, today in general, we want to know some issues about what we mean by individual differences. We're going to talk about a guy named Fleischmann's taxonomy of human abilities. We're going to look at the historical and current, approximately current approaches to the structure of human intelligence, or general mental ability. We'll talk about the validity that this thing that we call intelligence has. We'll discuss the concept of incremental validity, which from the broadest perspective is probably the most important thing in this lecture chunk. And then the second bit, or probably the other important thing, is a general concept called the bandwidth fidelity trade-off, which we will deal with somewhat extensively towards the end. So individual differences are we're not all like each other. I mean, some of these things are obvious, right? So at the simplest end of this, purely physical differences are individual differences. Some people are taller, heavier, have different skin tones, different different vocal registers, things like that. But in general, we're talking about this is with psychological differences in interests, talents, capabilities, those sorts of things. And we're talking about individual differences. The important thing about them is that they are relatively stable or enduring, right? That they don't change all the time. So, like at any given moment, I may be in a really good mood, and you may be in a really poor mood, and those are differences that set us apart, but that me being in a good mood and you being in a bad mood. Maybe normally you're in a better mood than I am. And we just happen to have shifted. So when we're talking about this, a lot of times people will use the term traits, which is there to define specifically these things that are relatively stable and enduring. So things that set people apart from one another for a very long time. And usually, psychologists in particular group these individual differences into several domains. Probably the most notable ones are cognitive ability, but also personality characteristics, interests, and values. So more sort of emotionally charged sorts of things. But then also physical abilities, which is an important domain for workplace selection, but not for all jobs. For a dentist, in the United States, the test that selects people into dental school involves manual dexterity. You need to be able to use your hands, and the same sort of thing goes for not all doctors, but certainly surgeons, and many doctors need to be able to use their hands with a certain amount of capability. Firefighters need to be able to lift a certain amount of weight, things like that. So there are physical abilities that differ amongst people and that are important for some jobs. Now, because they're not usually the kind of jobs we're going to talk about, we're not going to worry about that domain too much, but it is there. The other thing to keep in mind is that people sometimes conflate these. So when I talk about, say, cognitive abilities or quote unquote intelligence, people will think of that as being a pencil and paper test usually. But the idea here is like we might talk about an attribute being reasoning versus social skills, and people will tend to think about that reasoning as being something that you assess with a pencil and paper test, whereas the interview, using an interview to assess social skills. But you can use an interview to assess reasoning, and you can use pencil and paper tests to assess at least parts of social skills that are reliably related to other parts of social skills. So I think you can in general, once you identify an attribute of a person that you want to assess, you can choose which method you're going to use to do that assessment. Um, so Fleischmann broke up human abilities into this kind of taxonomy: cognitive, psychomotor, which is very much about, well, your ability to manipulate your body, like physical, like manual dexterity, fine motor skills, those sort of things. Perceptual abilities. So I wear very strong glasses. So in terms of perceptual abilities, my eyesight is pretty poor, but I tend to have better than average sense of smell and pretty good, pretty keen hearing as well. And physical abilities, typically we're talking about things like strength, speed, explosive quickness, those sorts of things. And we tend to usually in industrial organizational psychology and human resources and everything derived from them, we tend to focus on cognitive abilities, but others are certainly, as I mentioned already, are certainly useful for some fields. Probably when it comes to cognitive abilities, what captures most of the air in the room is what's sometimes called general mental ability or general cognitive ability, or sometimes intelligence, and even more unfortunately IQ, which hopefully will become clearer why I don't like that term. So Hunter and Schmidt in 1996 defined this concept as the ability to learn, but that's still too simple, because somebody who is what we would agree on is intelligent. They understand complex things. Like it's not just that they can learn, like maybe somebody who can learn lots of simple things is not as intelligent as somebody who spends a lot of effort, on learning one very complex thing. But they're also not only able to learn, but they're able to engage in complex reasoning. They can use logical processes. And probably most importantly, they adapt to the environment. In fact, that's a very um, Piaget sort of definition, is really how people adapt to their environment. So we'll talk a little bit about the history here, but just to try to get a hold of it, because a lot of times only somewhat jokingly people say that intelligence is what intelligence tests measure, but hopefully we'll clarify this somewhat. This is a picture of the U.S. Army's testing using the alpha form, which this was introduced during World War I as essentially, it was derived from like the Piagetian IQ test, the Stanford Binet approach, but designed to be administered not by a single psychologist to a single person, but to a whole room full of potential recruits. And the basic idea behind this was, trying to identify people who had basically better cognitive functioning, could be put in charge of various duty stations, maybe be made into officers, those sorts of things. Um, I don't want to spend a lot of time on factor analysis because it's kind of above the pay grade of this class, but this is how things work. So we give a sample of tests, a sample of items, or well, a set of items on a test to a group of people, and we try to see how it's structured, which is the basic idea is like, the tendency for people, if they get one question right, to get this other question right. So like on a set of test questions, each question, like your tendency to get it right or wrong, will be correlated. Like for each question will be correlated with positively with some other questions, maybe negatively with some others, maybe close to zero for others. So all the items, they kind of group together, they intercorrelate with one another. And the basic idea here is to try to figure out how many clumps there are in the test, like how many things are highly correlated with one another. And so when there's a set of items, let me just turn the camera back on for a second here, even though you really only have the backlit lighting from the screen. But the items that correlate with one another have a tendency to they'll clump together, and then we will tend to explain those as all being reflections or manifestations of a particular factor. And we want to be careful here because then people can try to make the factors into something real. This is a process that philosophers caution against by calling it reification, which is just making a concept into a thing. And I don't want to do that with these factors here. The factors are, I don't want to call them statistical artifacts, but they are statistical constructs. They're not necessarily things. They are useful tools. I think that's probably the best way to put them. And so, like I said, we start with the assumption that intelligence is what intelligence tests measure. And this is basically just because that's how people have tried to build them. They've tried to take what their ideas of what intelligence means, ask questions that are relevant to that, and sifted through those questions to find out which ones work well. And the big deal here, probably the person most responsible for this, is a guy named Charles Spearman, who had previously been a British Army engineer, and then became a psychologist after retiring from the Army. And basically what he noticed was that various tests of mental abilities all showed positive correlations with one another. So, in fact, this was basically the original stuff here was based on different subjects amongst British school children. And so things that probably shouldn't have a lot to do with each other. Like if you did well on math, you also probably did well on classics. If you did well on English, you probably did well on French. If you did well on music, you probably did well on math. They don't necessarily, the basic idea here is people tend to do basically well in school. Now that's not flat, it's not uniform. We all know people who, well, I don't know if we all know them, but many of us know people who are exceptionally gifted in mathematics and very, very poor at written composition. We know people who are musically talented but not good at the quote unquote book learning, right? So I don't want to say that just because somebody is good at math, they're good at everything. Although math is one of the most difficult subjects, and so if you're good at math, the likelihood of being good at least some of the other subjects is quite high. But that's neither here nor there. So Spearman, in fact, developed factor analysis. In fact, he had some novel mathematical or statistical techniques to get at this. Mostly what he called the method of vanishing tetrads, which is far too complicated to get into here. But the basic idea behind this really concluded that in general, like all test items are composed of two things: something specific to the test that was done, which you can essentially think of that as, probably not best to think of it as error and a statistical error term, but like oftentimes in factor analysis we call it uniqueness. And then this general factor, G, which he called little italicized g, and that's what we see it as. And that's what, like, if you want to talk about this, this domain competently as someone who is informed by the literature, you always want to, when people are going to talk about mental ability tests never refer to it as IQ, always refer to it as G. G is the statistical term, or the social scientific term for the statistical construct that is the fact that generally tests of mental abilities share a lot of variance with one another, which is just a fancy way of saying that when you do well on one of them, you tend to do well on a lot of other ones. So after that, there was other work with probably the most prominent psychometrician in the United States, probably in fact in North America, Louis Leon Thurstone, who developed this approach that an approach that was in many ways more statistically sophisticated. He called his approach primary mental abilities, which basically said that no, there wasn't a single unifying factor like G. There were several that broke up into things like verbal comprehension, space, which involves things like spatial rotation, which sort of like recognizing an unusual shape at two different angles, number, which is what it sounds like, memory, again, what it sounds like, and reasoning, kind of what it all. Most of the other ones are what they sound like. And so, like, the question here, well, like, there's a controversy between these two perspectives. Like, do you need one dimension or lots of them? And in general, like with Thurstone's work, even among primary abilities, they look distinct, but there were interrelationships among all of them, and that provides additional evidence that there is some kind of a general factor. And anyway, so eventually it was you kind of need both, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Guilford was another important contributor. His approach is called the structure of intellect, or the SOI model, but this is just way too complicated for anybody to worry about. That there were hundreds of specific cognitive abilities arrayed along these three dimensions. So the kind of operation that you're using, which is similar in some ways to the primary abilities, and the other approach, the content of the ability and the production, like the actual production of outcomes. But it was so unwieldy that no one has ever seriously used Guilford's system. The one thing that's significant here, and this is things that you will occasionally encounter in especially in training contexts, but you might encounter elsewhere in HR, is this concept of convergent versus divergent abilities, or convergent versus divergent thinking is how people usually talk about it now. Divergent thinking is really novelty. It's your ability to sort of like see a brick and see lots of different uses for it, essentially the opposite of functional fixedness. Whereas convergent ability is a little bit more prosaic, but it's really, you can think about it like divergent ability allows you to envision multiple possible solutions for a problem. Convergent thinking is what allows you to select one among a set of options that is probably going to work. So convergent is more conventional, but it's also in general, like within an organization, you need both of these. You need, well, typically to be strategically successful, you need creativity and efficiency, and that doesn't necessarily have to be embodied in one person. So you can have people who are really good at divergent thinking but suck at convergent thinking, and you could have other people who are really good at convergent thinking but not so great at divergent. So you can kind of separate and isolate your creativity and your conventionality to a degree, but you generally, for sort of a dynamic, strategically successful organization, you're going to need elements of both. This is probably my personal favorite approach to talking about this domain. So Cattell and Horn's investment theory, which basically posits that there are two pools of cognitive ability. One is called fluid intelligence, which is pretty similar to how previously Schmidt and Hunter had defined this. It's a general ability to learn and reason. And then there's crystallized intelligence, which is the actual knowledge that you've accumulated, right? So knowledge about mathematical and scientific facts, information about all the books that you've read. Basically, crystallized knowledge is usually declarative. It's stuff that you can either say or it's practical in the sense that it's like a skill that you can demonstrate. So, and the idea here is that your fluid intelligence is invested in the acquisition of crystallized intelligence. So you sort of pour, just like investing money in capital, you are applying your fluid intelligence at books, classes, teaching materials, hobbies and games even. But the basic idea is you are using your fluid intelligence to acquire more crystallized intelligence. And so you spend fluid intelligence to acquire specific knowledge, and skills. Now the important thing about this from this perspective, and this is although like the exact demarcations of fluid and crystallized intelligence are probably somewhat debatable, but this idea that fluid intelligence decreases with age. So it probably starts declining in people's mid-20s. So you all are probably good. I've been dropping on this for a decade and a half probably. But the important thing is that so while fluid intelligence decreases, it doesn't. No matter how little of it you have, you can keep using it. So even if I have less fluid intelligence than I did 15 years ago, I can still invest what I have. And it might take me longer to learn the same material than it would, all else being equal, years ago, but I can still do it. And that's not to say that sometimes like there are network effects in this. Like it's usually easier to learn stuff when you already know related stuff. So your crystallized, like you people can leverage their crystallized intelligence to kind of like take some of the burden off of fluid intelligence. The modern approach is that basically all of these basic ideas have some merit, and people have tried to figure out how it all fits together. And so in general, like amongst mainstream industrial organizational personality psychologists, this Carroll model or something like it is pretty well accepted. So he basically reanalyzed hundreds of factor analytic studies, and he proposed what he calls a three-stratum model. So there's three levels, and at the very top of this, at the most basic level, you have something that is essentially Spearman's G. It is basic intelligence. It is just your capacity to learn, reason, do those sorts of things. And at the next level, we've got several primary abilities, much like basically the Thurstone categories, but also typically most people will include both fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence in there. And then at the lowest level, there are increasingly specific abilities, like basically test factors, like things like perceptual speed, like which is tested for things like here's a block of letters, go through and cross out all of the A's that are in this, things like that, which is just basically you can recognize those things fast and cross them out. And that's like deeply specific and relatively unimportant in and of itself. So sometimes this is referred to as, like I said, the three-strata model, the Carroll model, or the Cattell-Horn-Carroll model. Any one of these will matter. And for practical purposes, the basic takeaway from this is that there is some basic scientific justification in using just like a general cognitive ability test. Like you are going to be measuring a reliable and demonstrable aspect of people. Now, there's a lot of other stuff going on here. So here's an example picture of the Cattell-Horn-Carroll models. You can see G at the top. You can see G at the top. Here's the primary or something similar to the primary abilities. And you can see in particular here is fluid intelligence, here is crystallized intelligence. This one I know offhand is this is verbal. This is the reasoning one, space, things like that. And then these are like all of the, like below each one of those is like those extremely specific abilities. There's also, in general, whenever we measure abilities, and this is something that's relevant for what we're going to like, how the final exam is going to be structured in this class, there are speed tests. So, for instance, probably the most commonly used cognitive ability test for human resources purposes is the Wonderlic personnel test. Out of, which is currently the company's headquartered in Chicago, Illinois, I believe. But it's a speed test, so there's 50 questions on it, and you have 12 minutes to answer it under normal administration. There are some alternative administrations for other purposes, but that's the primary method. And so how quickly you can answer the questions is important. So they're usually long tests, but the individual questions on them are comparatively easy. And so the Wonderlic is probably like is a useful example because like it increases in difficulty as you go through it. So like the earliest questions are very easy and you just kind of plow through those. But as you get further and further along, questions are harder and harder. Now, none of the questions, like if you had a lot of time, most people would probably be able to answer most of the questions on it. But when you're pressed for time, that's what makes it difficult. The alternative is a power test, which is usually like how I would think of how the final exam in this class is going to be structured, which is there's plenty of time to answer the questions. So these tests tend to be shorter tests, but made up of more difficult questions. And both of these are useful for assessing cognitive abilities, broadly speaking. Since, as you can tell from the test that I'm administering to you, I think power tests, especially for something like this, like a course, are wiser. They allow more deep and complex assessment of a person's learning of the material. So they are more aligned with good assessment of crystallized knowledge, so the crystallized intelligence, whereas the speed tests are certainly assessing crystallized knowledge, but in the putting so much emphasis on quickly being able to do it is sort of getting at that sort of raw processing speed. So it's closer to fluid intelligence. I don't want to overemphasize that. And oh, I didn't take this slide out. Under normal circumstances, I would be in class be giving a short version of the Wonderlic, but well, that's not going to work this week, especially. So here we go. So I guess the question here is, with the ability test, what are we measuring? And I don't want anybody to just go away thinking that, we're measuring intelligence as some sort of like innate, intrinsic part of people's personhood, because that's not what we're doing. Tests can only measure an individual's current repertoire, which is their set of knowledge, skills, and abilities, and all of those are learned behaviors, and all of those are a function of that person's genetics. So there are genetic factors that affect whether or not people learn quickly and broadly. But beyond that, there's also interests. Like, you're probably going to do better at mathematics if you're interested in it. The social environment, so like, did you have good teachers? And were your parents supportive? Were there lots of books in your home growing up? Did your parents read to you? All of those sorts of things. Educational opportunities, that's pretty obvious. Like, without some kind of education, whether that's formal or informal, whatever, but people have to, like, one thing that is, although there might be disputes about sort of like the reality of fluid and crystallized intelligence, people actually have to learn things in order to take these tests, generally speaking. They have to be literate, verbal, and so forth. And there's the overall developmental environment, which includes things like um, did your mother have health problems while she was pregnant with you? Did she have a good diet then? Did you have a good diet when you were young? And then the rest of the sort of things that are concomitant or concomitant with what I've mentioned before. So one of my mentors, Chuck Hewlin, is known for several of his dicta, and this one is probably the most notable, which is he said that you can't measure someone's innate intelligence any more than you can measure the innate height of a stalk of corn. And the basic idea is, maybe there is some sort of locked genetic potential, like a maximum height that an individual stalk of corn could possibly reach. But in the end, it's going to be a function of the soil that it was planted in, the care that it was tended with, the weather that it experienced throughout its growth history, the kind of fertilizer that it was exposed to, how much sun there was, all of those sorts of things. So, like in general, people have at different times like, for instance, I think probably the clearest thing here is in the United States, the SAT is now just the SAT, but it has been, the Scholastic Ability Test, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, the Scholastic Achievement Test, and finally they've admitted, like, by just making it the SAT as opposed to any of those specific acronyms, the makers of the test are really basically admitting that the difference between aptitude, ability, and achievement, which again, really like aptitude and ability are really hard to pull apart. But aptitude is the idea that sort of like people might have a knack for something. Ability is their sort of capacity to do something, and achievement is very much like their demonstrated attainment in an area. But in the end, essentially all of these things, like no matter how much you're trying to measure aptitude or ability, you are fundamentally measuring achievement to some degree or another. Like again, we can only assess people's current repertoire of the current repertoire of behaviors that they're able to demonstrate, and those are all learned. So, or at least at the level that we're talking about intelligence. I mean, human beings don't have a lot of purely instinctive behaviors that are at all meaningful by the time you're even an older child, let alone anything else. So I don't want to overemphasize any particular thing, but basically, these are not intrinsic, they're not fundamental, and they're certainly not relevant in terms of a person's moral worth. Just the thing is, like as we'll see with in fact in just a moment, what's good about G is basically it predicts lots of important outcomes. So like for what we're usually going to talk about here, like people who have high G succeed at school and they have good job performance. And all people will disparage that somewhat, but basically, like standard sort of statistical approaches will show that it's like even when you control for socioeconomic status and education, so people from highly similar backgrounds who have different levels of G, the person who is quote unquote smarter will do better in these domains. So it's there. Now again, there's none of this is as simple and separable as that makes it seem, and I don't want people to walk away with that. But basically, as a tool in the sort of like toolbox of HR professionals, cognitive ability tests can be quite helpful. Because if you like have a complex job, if you hire someone pretty smart to do it, they're probably going to do an okay job. And in general, like when we talk about the validity of little g, all we're really talking about there is the correlation of the intelligence or the cognitive ability test with job performance measures or job performance criteria, and the validity changes as a function of the job complexity. But for moderately complex jobs, which most jobs in sort of like the developed post-industrial economies that we're talking about, Canada, the United States, Western Europe, East Asia, even most jobs are moderately complex. And it decreases for jobs being less complex. So around like zero point 0.2, the correlation metric is about 0.23 for unskilled jobs. And in fact, I've seen it as low as like 0.17 for very unskilled jobs, like literally kind of like taking a box off a truck and putting it on a conveyor belt. Cognitive ability still predicts job performance doing that, just not as well as anywhere else. And I've seen it as high as zero point 0.7 for highly complex jobs like management and other professional jobs. Um, so the other thing is to keep in mind is this concept of incremental validity. When we want to use more than one predictor, we want the second one to add significantly to our ability to predict job performance. So the idea basically is like what we're doing with predictors is we are going to try to combine unique pieces of information and unique with respect to the outcome that we want to predict. So we want to know more about a person's likely job performance based on combining two or more predictors. So the gain in it's like if I just have cognitive ability, that's its validity. If I add something to cognitive ability, the difference in the correlation, that difference is the incremental validity. And so in general, we get the most incremental validity from unrelated predictors. So if we have like a combination here with what I've got listed as say like mathematical ability and social dominance, which basically have Okay, so these two concepts, like so mathematical ability and social dominance, which is basically leadership potential, more or less. Um, and when I say social dominance, that's what I mean is sort of like I'm comfortable being in control of situations, not social dominance orientation, which people may have heard of, which is more about being authoritarian. But we get big incremental validity out of those two, as long as social dominance was related to the performance criterion that we're interested in. Whereas two different tests of mathematical ability will have effectively zero incremental validity because it's the same thing twice. Now, two different specific mathematical abilities might have, so if we measured algebra and trigonometry, probably not a lot of incremental validity, but depending on what was going on here. Like let's say that the job actually drew on both of those capacities and drew on them differentially rather than in a more cumulative sense, then we might be able to get some incremental validity. But the basic idea here is we want predictors that have very little to do with one another, but both so we want the predictors to have very little to do with one another. So like if they're like two tests of mathematical ability are right on top of each other, very little. Maybe like the algebra and trigonometry example here. Okay, they're overlapping, but not completely so. And then something like the math and social dominance. These two have nothing to do with one another. And so as long as they're both related to the outcome, you're going to get a bigger additional bang for your buck adding that second one. And then as far as it goes, like there's in general, and this is like a statistical truth, that with bandwidth and fidelity, you can either measure something broadly or you can measure it precisely. So the example, like one example here is a 1 hour exam on algebra versus a 1 hour exam on all of math, right? You have the same amount of time. They both take 1 hour, but one of them is narrowly focused on algebra and one of them is narrowly focused on, or is broadly focused on any topic in math. So you can kind of think about this as like, you know, each one of those is defining like the test space is defining a universe of questions that you could possibly ask. And like the example with math, that's a much bigger universe of possible questions. And therefore, you know, since you have the same amount of time, you're going to ask about the same number of questions. And so your sample set of items in the second example is going to be much proportionally smaller. Same thing like, a 1 hour exam of something like industrial organizational psychology versus a 1 hour exam on specifically the content from this lecture, cognitive ability. Um, again, in that case, the second example is much narrower. The first one would probably include items from the second one, but amongst a lot of other ones. So the thing real take home on this, if you're interested in a broad outcome like job performance, it's usually best to use a broad predictor measure like G. You essentially want to match the bandwidth of your measures. And this is something where we sometimes see, like, there for a period of time, social psychologists thought that attitudes didn't predict behavior very well, but that's because the attitudes were so much broader than the behaviors that they were predicting. Whereas, like, something like, if we're interested in predicting at work behavior based on a job attitude like job satisfaction, we can actually do a pretty good job with it. Because when you go, like, if you wake up every morning and you hate your job, you think about that and it affects what you actually do. Um, there are some dark sides to consider with cognitive ability, and like the details on this are something we can talk about in the next live session, I think. But there is a notable race so-called IQ gap that basically there tend to be like about 10 to 15 point gaps between black Americans, well, black individuals, Caucasians, and Asians. And the why, there's a lot of complicated things out there, like, and so the real take home from it is there's mm, essentially zero evidence that this is something intrinsic, like that there are, like, that the differences are due in any sort of intrinsic or essential way because of race. Like, it's like not appropriate to say that black people are dumber than white people on average, who are dumber than Asian people on average. That doesn't work. There are let's just leave it at social and economic reasons for this. And this is most notable, I think, in the United States, for instance. Black American, like, everybody's been, like, people have been getting quote unquote smarter for decades. This is something called the Flynn effect, and it amounts to about, what, 7 IQ points every decade, something like that. But Black Americans are gaining slightly faster than everybody else, and so that's evidence of a secular trend, not which means something like in the world, not something in, like, people are not evolving and changing their DNA that fast. That's not what this is. It's about health, nutrition, educational access, social conditioning, oppression, and all of those sorts of things. So I don't want to, like, from our standpoint in HR, like, the causes of this are not that important, and we'll deal with the consequences of this in a few weeks when we talk about bias in selection. Is one score enough? Well, G or IQ is not a hugely rich topic, but in general, like, there is no evidence for these theories of multiple intelligences, like Howard Gardner's thing, well, the only thing there is bodily kinesthetic, which is basically your ability to, like, acquire new physical skills. That seems to separate out, but every other time that people have tried to make, differences between, like, practical intelligence or street smarts or anything else, they all tend to wind up clumping together. And there's plenty of evidence that these scores actually do account for real world success, or, well, do predict real world success. I don't want to say account for it, because they don't. And people claim that it isn't diagnostically useful, which it is. It's useful at predicting lots of things. So I don't So this is a useful tool. I'm just going to leave this slide up long enough for people to read it, but it's not hugely important for what we're doing. Suffice it to say, like in almost all settings that you'll be working, if you do administer one of these tests, it's going to be computer-based, either online or some other sort of computer-based administration. This whole thing about computer adaptive testing is probably less important. So you can take a look at this, but it's not hugely important for us. This is more so the kind of thing that is important for large testing programs like various college or university admissions tests, large scale certification tests like nursing certification exams and those sorts of things. So it's not too relevant to most of us. Now, if you wind up working in those domains, then it's going to be hugely relevant. But here, like for almost everybody here, and by almost everybody, I mean seriously almost everybody, not something to worry about. Okay, so that being said, we should talk about personality a bit. And well, I have lots of experience dealing with intelligence. Personality is really where I've done most of my research. And so I like to lead this with, although it's somewhat the antiquated language comes from the fact that the book that I'm quoting from is from the 1930s. This is by the social anthropologist Clyde Kluckhohn and the clinical psychologist Henry Murray. So in some respects, a man is like A, all other men, B, some other men, and C, no other man. And so what this is getting at is there are some ways that basically every person is the same, right? Like it doesn't matter your cultural background, your personality, those sorts of things. We all need to eat. We all want companionship. We all want shelter and warmth and those sorts of things. Like there are some basics to human nature. And then the C is like no other person. And sometimes I update this, like in the textbook I wrote last year. I included this quotation, but updated it to just use person or people anywhere that this says it. But that people are unique. That there are things about you that are, you really are a beautiful and unique snowflake in some respects. But what we're talking about here with personality psychology is focused on this B level, how people are similar to one another, but different from others. So the basic idea here is what we're looking at with personality, or at least the level that most personality psychology works with, is to try to understand, are there basic features that are universal to humanity, but that people differ on? And again, then the answer seems to be more or less yes. So here we want a basic working definition of personality. There were some traditional criticisms, and I'm going to kind of breeze through those and then talk about kind of the most important model of personality. And then kind of like we talked about, kind of like how we talked about race differences in intelligence and how that's controversial but slightly overblown, but something that we do need to be aware of. We'll talk a little bit about there are some small but potentially important gender differences in personality. On the plus side here, there's really no racial differences on the plus side. So here, in particular, probably the core, the absolute core takeaway here is going to be this part, this 5-factor model. Like that's going to be something that you really want to know. The basic definition of personality is, well, if you ask, 5 different personality psychologists to define personality, you'd probably get 6 different answers. But the basic idea here is like a personality is a person's characteristic way of thinking, feeling, and behaving that generalizes across a wide variety of situations. And we want to be careful about this. So, for instance, people who are outgoing, probably talk more in one-on-one conversation, ask more questions in class settings, talk to more people at parties, and try to find people to interact with when they're all bored or alone, right? So again, it's not that it's always going to be the same behaviors. That would be maladaptive. What they're trying to do is to, like a person who's outgoing wants to interact with other people. Like that's something they value, that they get a lot of reinforcement from, that they enjoy. So if they're alone, they're probably more motivated to find people to talk to. And if there are people to talk to, they're probably going to talk more than someone who is less outgoing. Um, we'll hopefully deal with more examples as we go. There was a big controversy, like basically, and this affected HR type functions a lot. So, like in the late 1960s, there were critiques from both within sort of like the what would eventually be human resources and from personality and social psychologists. So there was this critique, the situationist critique, that personality, like to the extent that it even existed, it didn't matter. The situations were strong enough and just dominated it. And so like this kind of straw man version of this is whether or not you're talkative has more to do with whether there's people around to talk to and less to do with you. And in general, sure. There is variance due to the person, so your personality affects what you do, and the situation affects what you do. So how the two parts interact is the most important. Like that's what actually determines like specific behaviors. Um, they're within sort of like the more well, in fact, in personnel psychology, which is kind of like the discipline that eventually became human resource management. Guyon and Guttier had this really influential critique that was interpreted as saying that personality was not useful for making staffing decisions. And so it fell out of favor in a lot of management applications for a variety of reasons that they raised. Like they were concerned that personality tests might be too invasive, which they probably were at the time. Like since most full-fledged personality tests were designed to be clinical measures. So things like the Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory, which assesses psychopathology, that probably is too invasive. In fact, in the United States, it's considered a medical exam and is protected by things like the Americans with Disabilities Act and HIPAA. So you, like as an employer, you typically cannot use it. There are some exceptions, but typically cannot. And there's concern that this part last today, that self-ratings are a problem. So that, i.e., that personality test results can be faked. That people can say like, oh, you're looking for this kind of employee, and I can answer it like I'm that kind of a person, whether or not I am. And there, and this was the real concern was that they reviewed evidence that seemed to indicate that personality tests did not predict job performance very well. And as we'll see in a few minutes, that's somewhat overblown. It is personality is not as good a predictor as some other aspects, say cognitive ability, but it does work. So the big thing here is that personality isn't like a monolithic thing like cognitive ability was. Like the nice thing about cognitive ability is it all sort of points the same way. All of the tests lump together into one thing, G, and in general, being more G is better. So you have these sort of situations where like we have multiple dimensions of personality. They don't all point the same way for the same performance criteria. And there's also this problem with what's sometimes called the jingle-jangle fallacy, which meant that people were studying the same things with different names and studying different things with similar names and studying things at different levels of analysis. So there was just kind of so it took a long time before people to be able to to review the literature and personality coherently. Uh, so I don't really want to waste a lot of time on this because it's not hugely important for what we're doing, but I will just say, like, we had to learn how to organize things, and that came from this thing that the personality psychologist Luke Goldberg calls the lexical hypothesis, which he attributed to Francis Galton. So the basic idea here is you believe that language is evolutionarily adaptive, and it helped human beings survive by allowing us to communicate important information. And so the words that we use to talk about other people would encode the most important domains of individual differences. Therefore, personality traits would be captured in words we use to describe each other, and that means that they would be in the dictionary. And that's where Cattell, well, first Gordon Allport and his colleague um, did work in the 30s too. So they reviewed the dictionary and they pulled out tons and tons of terms that could be used to describe individuals, and they grouped those into four different categories. So things that were states, things that were kind of obscure and metaphorical, like my favorite one there is Jovian, which is like the god Jupiter or Zeus. Evaluative, which is like basically I'm going to call this person good or bad, and then things that they considered stable personality descriptors. So they got rid of these first three categories as not being useful for the kinds of studies they were going to do. But this pruning is something that leaves people with criticisms. Like if you leave in those first, the evaluative words, you get two wholly new dimensions of personality, which is positive and negative valence. Whereas positive valence is basically how awesome, brilliant, wonderful a person is, and negative valence is essentially how evil or wicked a person is. One teacher that I had once asked, like, if we were going to use the five-factor model, which we'll get into more detail in a moment, how would you describe someone like Hitler? Very, very disagreeable, or having negative valence as like that man is evil is useful. So let's. I'm not going to worry about this. Probably one of the most notable things here with the five-factor model, the five-factor model and other personality inventories being captured by it is most people who are affiliated with HR in some way are at least somewhat familiar with the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, the MBTI, or its generic knockoff, the QC temperament sorter. Those both measure four of the big five. So extroversion, introversion is what it sounds like, it's extroversion. Thinking versus feeling. Thinking is being disagreeable, feeling is being agreeable. The intuition versus sensing is intuition is high in openness, sensing is low in openness, and then judging is high in conscientiousness versus perceiving is low in conscientiousness. So the four domains cover that unreliably, since it dichotomizes people as to being either extroverts or introverts, whereas this is actually the dimension is pretty normally distributed, as are all of these. Most people fall near the middle, and so as a result, if you take the MBTI, one day you might be an extrovert, the next day you might be an introvert, and you could bounce, like especially if you're very close to the middle, you would bounce around a lot due to just measurement error. It also doesn't tend to, because of various measurement problems associated with it. Not only is it unreliable that way, but it's not as predictive of things like job performance outcomes as better developed personality measures, and it doesn't measure neuroticism, which is there are people who will argue that it's one of the most important domains in an HR context, although usually most of us would say conscientiousness, but it's certainly, for like the standpoint of personality, probably the most important dimension overall. Like it's like people who are high in neuroticism are going to be more prone to virtually all psychological challenges. depression, anxiety disorders, mood disorders, those sorts of things. Like you're very high in neuroticism. I mean, you're it's a risk factor, is what I should say, for those things. So the MBTI unreliably and invalidly measures 4 of the big 5, and the one that it ignores is probably the most important psychological domain. Now, that being said, the 5-factor model, and I think later slide may point this out, the 5-factor model is a little bit deficient. Like there are, like for instance, like when you start from the ground up in other languages, sometimes you get an extroversion fact, like a second extroversion factor. Like if you start, like if you develop, take the approach here and develop a personality scale natively in Spanish, you get 2 different extroversion factors. You can break down most of these into different domains. But probably the most significant one is there's now a 6-factor model called the Hexaco, which the H basically is just this, but including an H factor, which stands for honesty, humility, which is basically well, an absence of the major agentic personality disorders. So, like, basically people, well, I mean, it is what it sounds like. People who are both on it, like people who score high on the H factor, are honest and humble. So generally are conventionally moral. So I'm not going to worry too much about those sorts of details. The one thing that we really want to focus on is what personality scales measure. It depends a little bit on whether you're asking the person or somebody who knows them. If you're asking them, you're getting their view of how they want other people to see them, and if you ask somebody else, you're basically getting a reputational report. So that's the thing that, like, the basic idea here that really comes to come away from this lecture with is that people use personality. Like if you ask someone to fill out a personality test, they're treating it is formally the same as a job interview. Like people are not probably going to answer completely honestly, but they're doing the same sort of thing they do in a job interview, which is they're showing you the best version of themselves that they want you to see. So they're communicating how they want to be viewed. And so there's a lot of other stuff here, but the basic idea is, when you look at personality and job performance, the basic idea is that both of those are summaries of their past behavior. And so they should be related. And in fact, they are. Again, personality traits are just like cognitive ability. They do have a fairly substantial genetic component, but again, it's all what personality actually is about developmental experience, habit formation, lots of those sorts of things. So while personality traits are heritable, they are not biological destinies. Like the stuff I said, like if you happen to realize that you are quite neurotic, that doesn't mean you're going to have like major depression or an anxiety disorder or any of that sort of stuff. I don't want to, like, it's not destiny here. So they're not just a social construction. They're not just lies that we tell ourselves to like make the world make sense, but they're not so rigid that being disagreeable is a jail sentence, or being highly neurotic is a guarantee of mental challenges later on. That's not the way it works. So now, just to get into the really HR relevant stuff, the validity of personality, probably the most important thing here was in the 1991 meta-analysis by Barrick and Mount. Basically, what they did is they were the first ones to go in and use those 5 factors to organize the previous studies. And even though they made some mistakes, what they tended to find was that in general, like across all occupations, extroversion had a small but reliable prediction of performance across all of their 3 performance criteria, and that conscientiousness actually worked pretty well. Like doesn't matter about the criteria or the occupations. It works. It works, and more. Like I said, they made some mistakes, and then what they tend to find is that this actually I'm going to cross out this Jackson and Rothstein because it turns out they made some real mistakes, so let's not really worry about that. But then in 2003, Joyce Hogan and Brent Holland found that emotional stability, so neuroticism, was the across all categories and all jobs that it was the best predictor of performance. Like I said, in general, I think there are reasons to be a little bit slightly skeptical of this study just because they only used the in-house test, the Hogan test itself. So while this is not necessarily just an ad for their test. There are some incentives there, and that it's not necessarily completely generalizable, even if everything was totally above board. So I think like if you talk to most psychologists, management professors, HR professionals, if you wanted to say like ask them about like which personality characteristic is the which dimension is the best predictor of job performance, almost everyone would say conscientiousness. Um, we probably don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but just the basic idea here is the big five have facets. So like the example here is that extroversion is composed of like this sort of social vitality, which is sociability. That's the part where it's like, I want to go to parties, and social dominance or social assertiveness, which is sort of like leadership-like tendencies. And conscientiousness is made up, has these facets of, at the very minimum, achievement and dependability. And the important thing here is like, I mean, for instance, like looking at across the lifespan, social vitality declines over time, but social dominance increases as people age. But that makes extroversion look pretty flat over the life course. Conscientiousness, like if you want to look at conscientiousness doesn't do, except for a couple of settings like the military. In general, conscientiousness doesn't predict attaining a leadership role. But if you break it down, achievement does, but dependability does not. So those are just a couple of examples, but the basic idea here is, in general, each of the big five dimensions has at least two facets. Typically more, although there are always two that are highly prominent. And so, like especially with conscientiousness, there are several highly replicable facets of conscientiousness, and that those facets may do a better job in some cases of predicting outcomes than the kind of mishmashed higher level one. I'm not going to worry about that. Don't really want to worry about that. Probably we'll talk a little bit about group differences, and I think that's the last major thing of importance here is, in general, like between racial and ethnic groups, there's no real differences in personality. Now there are some small differences between men and women. So like women are slightly higher on integrity and dependability, but about equal on achievement. Like when we're looking at sort of like conscientiousness sort of things, and probably when we look at that extroversion dimension, um, well, are more socially relevant. Women tend to be slightly higher on affiliation. So they tend to be slightly more agreeable on average than men are, but slightly lower on that social potency, social dominance aspect of extroversion. The one notable difference is a couple of different personality inventories directly measure masculinity, which is also sometimes called rugged individualism. And on average, men score much higher than women on that. But again, that's different. Like for instance, most male psychology graduate students, which I was once upon a time, score like the average woman on that. take from that what you will. But again, that's typical. Like the thing there is that tends to be more that those are measures of typical masculine interests rather than any kind of anything even close to an inherent personality characteristic. Um, Masculinity, femininity dimensions are highly like the behaviors that's assessing are extremely socialized and learned. That probably accounts for or I don't want to say accounts, but it is a large piece of the explanation why that is so different. Whereas the other differences here are the average differences are very small, and I mean that can there are some nuances to go into with that, but the basic idea here is they're very small, and most people are not going to make that big of a deal about them. Now, every once in a while, some people do, like Larry Summers at Harvard, although that was more about cognitive abilities in the early 2000s, or notably recently, Jordan Peterson at the University of Toronto has made a bit of hay with this in ways that I think are completely over overblown in terms of the explanations that they're trying to put on it. Like are these differences do not explain larger social trends, or at least they're not doing a lot of work there. The final issue that people are concerned with personality is faking. There's a legitimate concern about whether people fake good on personality tests. Again, essentially that people are like, this is what an ideal employee would look like, so I'm going to answer this question pretending to be the ideal employee, and then I will get a really good score on it and then do well. And there's something, this is generally sits close to an issue that's called malingering in the clinical literature, where people basically fake sick or fake quote unquote crazy. So when people are, like for instance, people are trying to be found mentally incompetent so that they won't go to trial, like criminal trial or something along those lines. So people do definitely fake bad, and that's called malingering. So this fake good definitely seems like a possibility, and the experiments tend to show that when you ask people to improve their scores in specific ways, they can do that. But the validity studies show that that the personality tests still work in the real world. So even if people are faking, they're faking in a way that doesn't severely impair the validity of personality tests for personnel selection purposes. So in general, we can use them in selection. And there is research being done to detect and correct for faking. And in general, like so far, that doesn't seem to be a good idea. Most attempts, like over the last couple of decades, to correct for faking just impair validity, and basically what that does is it decreases the decision quality. All right, well, thanks for bearing with me this week, and hopefully I'll be able to post this before too long. All right, thanks so much. Have a good one, and hopefully next week is normal. All right, take care. Bye.